Okay, so like I was saying, we've got the factors of production. We've got that's the good news of kind of emerging capitalism in the early part of the 1800s in the United States. You got the bad news, which is you get with every boom, you get a bust. Panic of 1819. Um, Immigrants are coming over Germany, Scandinavia. They got money. They got skills. They're becoming artisans. They're becoming farmers. We got industry. We've got infrastructure. We got all of this stuff. So we also have the other side of things, which is the labor exploitation. Two forms of it. Well, there's many forms of it, but two main ones which we'll focus on. Obviously, slavery, and then what at the time period the emerging term would be wage slavery or white slavery. Wage earners in the North aren't too keen on this idea, and they start comparing themselves to slaves. Right, it's the whole thing. Okay, so slavery. Um, Slavery's on it's declining in the North in particular, but even in the South, slavery is declining as we move from the 1700s to the 1800s. In the first three decades, right, so 1800, 18 teens, and 1820s, it goes up big time. Obviously, most infamously, this is because of cotton and the cotton gin, which makes it easier to separate the silk, the cotton silk, from the outside husk and the seed. And then, right, continuing expropriation of native land means you've got all of this land. You've got a bunch of laborers who you're not going to pay any wages for, and you've got a product that can earn you top dollar. Put one, two, and three together, and we get the creation of the Black Belt, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, all of these huge cotton plantations. In the Revolutionary period, no one would have tried to justify slavery by saying that they loved the enslaved laborers. The justification, if there was one, for slavery in the mid to late 18th century was patriarchal, right? I am the man. I am the ruler of my family. I sometimes rule with an iron fist. I tell people what to do. I'm mean, but I get things done. That's my job. And that's why I have these enslaved laborers, right? I tell them what to do. They follow my orders. I am the patriarch. Um, in the 1800s, that begins to shift from like stern, like patriarchal figure to a paternalist. Well, these are my children and I love them and I take care of the kids and I feed and clothe them when they're old and they can no longer work and they're like brothers and sisters to me. That's paternalism, right? This idea that somehow slavery is about affect, about love, about duty, that shifts. And why, so what? It matters because it becomes more ingrained in the kind of fabric of Southern life when it becomes emotional, right? That white Southerners of all class backgrounds, but the rich ones in particular, become emotionally attached to slavery um, in very weird ways. Okay, so here's the stats, right? 1790, you've got 700,000. By 1860, you have 4 million enslaved laborers. You have what is known as the internal slave trade, the worn out and dried up tobacco fields of Virginia are no longer producing the way they did in like the late 1600s. But they're producing a lot of enslaved human beings, and people are sold down the river, as it were. The phrase being sold down the river, that's where this comes from, to the deep south. Working conditions are far harsher. Chance of escape is much less, and it's not a good deal. Families are split up and separated. A a terrible addition to what is already a kind of genocidal process happening over generations. Um, the South it starts to develop new labor techniques. There is a traditional way of understanding slavery that it somehow predates capitalism. It's feudal in nature, so it has to predate mercantilism and mercantilism into capitalism? Absolutely not, right? The latest generation of scholars in history have done extensive research showing that enslavers were very keen on keeping very strict accounts, on encouraging quotas and picking minimums that you had to meet or you'd get punished. Time management, right? People effectively clocking in at a specific time, working a certain set of hours. All of the stuff that we generally associate with something like the Lowell Mills in New England, a lot of these techniques are actually developed in the South. First, before they're tried out in kind of Yankeedom of the North and in these factories, they're tried out in the South. So that's very important to remember. The slavery isn't some weird anomaly, right? It's plugged into a global network of a global economic system. And it's reliant on enslaved labor, whether it's England, New England, or the South. Okay. Meanwhile, because they're investing so much money in human chattel property, they are not investing in infrastructure, in education, in anything, right? They're not industrializing like the North is. They're not diversifying their economy. There's no, when we hear about innovation, Eli Whitney, right? This is northern. It's northern stuff. It might be used in the South, but it's northern stuff. So the South is kind of becoming a backwater here. But right, it's not just elite white enslavers and enslaved Africans. There's also poor and middling whites, and indeed, poor whites are happy to know that they have something in common with the rich whites, and that is to say the color of their skin, and they hold on to that for dear life because it is the only thing that they have that separates them. Well, that's not true, right? They're free. So even if you're poor and impoverished or a tenant farmer, you at least are free. You own your own person, right? So that is significant. But in every other respect, right, besides the color of their skin and their status, they're more similar to an enslaved laborer than to any rich Southerner. So, right, you can get the Calvin candy is the gift that keeps on giving. Okay, so that's the South. And in the North, the Republican ideal, and the Scandinavians are doing this, Germans are doing this. The Republican ideal is yeoman farmers, fully independent, artisan craftspeople, fully independent, because that's what you need to have Republican governance. You can't have someone that's reliant on someone else, because then you get all kinds of shenanigans with paying people for their vote, or corruption of the system. Their labor is valued, right? This idea that everyone is an equal. They all have, whether it's their crops or their craft, they are good at something. You apprentice with someone and you eventually, the thinking goes, they teach you the skills you need to become an artisan. You take great pride in your work. You are not alienated from the product of your labor. You feel very proud of it, right? That's what you need to have Republican virtue and Republican governance. Well, I got bad news for you. The capitalist reality is that it ain't gonna be how it works. Sorry, Thomas Jefferson. Sorry, Revolutionary Generation. Sorry, Declaration of Independence. But when the rubber hits the road, mechanization puts a lot of these crafts out of business. It also puts farmers out of business. Increasingly, people who can afford the big agricultural machines are the ones that dominate the field, literally and figuratively, I suppose. Smaller farmers who can't compete with that scale of production go out of business. What happens to their property? It's gobbled up by the bigger, right? We have a trend towards monopoly here. So all these people out of work, what do? They flock to cities. And they start working in wage labor. They're not super keen on it because, again, the idea of Republican virtue is that you are independent. That's why they don't want to use the term master and servant. They take up the Dutch phrase boss. Because it's like, well, at least I can pretend that I'm not serving another person and I'm not reliant on another person for my livelihood. And as opposed to apprentices becoming artisans, you're just a wage laborer, right? You wake up in the morning, you sell your labor power to someone, and then you wake up the next morning and you do it again. And whatever wage you get is the wage that person wants to pay you. Tough luck. Right, you're a wage laborer now. Industry and innovation kind of fuels this. Again, improved technologies means increased profits. Improved technologies also means more people out of work. More people out of work means more people competing for that job, which means the wages go down, which means the profit goes up, which means the technology, you can buy more technologies, recapitalize, reinvest. But more people out of work, you see where this is going. Again, not a great turn of events if you're a fan of either democracy or republicanism. But if you're a fan of the economy, right, it does wonders for the American economy. So you got to break some eggs to make an omelet. Labor is not thrilled at this prospect, and they push back in various ways. They organize in various ways. Mutual aid organizations, these are basically like almost like insurance, right? That a group of laborers would pay into a mutual aid society, and then if someone was injured or laid off, they could borrow from the funds that accrued in the mutual aid society. Actually, the Bank of America was initially a mutual aid society called the Bank of Italian America. This is later in the 1880s, but it was founded as a mutual aid society for Italian immigrants. And they became so successful that they just became, right, a bank. Unions, obviously, hopefully we know what a union is, and we have a realistic understanding of what a union is. Not some warped perspective, but unions allow for collective bargaining. That is to say, it's not just me, singular individual, and the big company, right, saying, well, I want $20 an hour. And they say, get lost. We'll give you 30 cents an hour. And if you don't like it, we'll hire that person for 30 cents an hour. Collective bargaining is me and hundreds of other people all say, we want X amount of dollars an hour, and if you don't like it, we're going to go on strike, and then you're going to lose more money than you would have if you just gave us the money. That's collective bargaining. It is one way that laborers try to get more power over their own their own working conditions. And if you're looking at this stuff and going, oh, this sounds a lot like communism or whatever. Yeah, sure. But this is before that exists, right? So we're talking about the 1820s, 1830s. The first real utopian socialist thinkers are writing in the 1830s, right? Like our Karl Marx is like 20 or some 25 or something like that, right? So that we might see this history and go, oh, there's all this ideological stuff attached to it, but that comes later, right? That the actual ideology comes after people are demanding, right, more working rights and more say in the kind of labor that they do, or more share of the profit or whatever. That stuff is first. That workers are coming up with the ideas before any like egg-headed European intellectual is writing about this stuff. And then it later does, right? The political theory then later does inform some of this stuff. The organizing. 1842 Commonwealth versus Hunt. no one cares, right? It's theoretically allows for peaceful unions. It's largely ignored by industry and government. They continue to oppose unionizing efforts. And then again, immigration, when it does increase in the 1840s, as I've said, by the 1840s, these are now people, especially like the latter half of the 1840s, because there's all these revolutions in Germany in 1845, 46. So people who are leaving after that revolutionary period are actually reading like socialist, communist, early anarchist thought. And then they're coming and combining with the kind of organic American strains of organizing and activism. They become kind of one. So that is the longer history. And this stuff is going to be with us, right, forever, right? So the idea of who holds the power, is it the kind of, the mercantile class or the capitalist class or the workers? This in some ways mirrors the debate between Hamilton and the Federalists and Jefferson. Jefferson wants more power at the state level, ultimately to give more power to the people, right? To individual yeomen or Republican citizens or whatever, where Hamilton wants more power at the federal level, more power at the bank level, at the level of, heads of industry. This is the same argument, right? So that in a lot of ways, the workers or the working class of this time period are Jeffersonian. They're not farmers; they're wage laborers, but they are more likely to vote Democratic Republican for precisely that reason. And as we'll see next time. In the lecture on Andrew Jackson, they are also the reason Andrew Jackson is a thing, because he is all about all power to the people, if you're white and a man. So that will be next time, chapter 9.